To make a statement. Secretary of State Williamson.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make a statement regarding the opening of educational settings, our plans to help children catch up, and the arrangements we have put in place for qualifications. The Prime Minister announced on Monday a cautious roadmap for the gradual relaxation of our current social restrictions. It isn't quite the end, but the end is very clearly in sight. As the House is by now aware, the rates of COVID infection have come down enough for us to let children go back to school from Monday, the 8th of March. Secondary and college students will be back from that date after being offered an on-site COVID test. University students on practical courses who need to access specialist facilities can also return to campus from the 8th of March and will be reviewing the timing for return of remaining students during the Easter holidays. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister spoke of a one-way road to freedom. For this reason, we have issued detailed guidance about what we expect all schools and colleges do to welcome children and students back. There will be a robust testing regime in place that will be critical in breaking the chains of COVID infection. More than 4 million tests have already been completed across primary, secondary schools, colleges and universities. I know that staff have worked very hard to set up testing sites in schools and have had time to get used to the supervising the testing that goes on. I know that the whole House will join me in thanking every one of them for the incredible efforts they continue to make to keep young people safe and learning. Primary school staff will continue to receive 2 home tests a week, and this will be extended to private early years providers. Secondary school and college students will be offered 3 tests in school and college when they return over the first 2 weeks, to be undertaken 3 to 5 days apart. Students will then be offered 2 home tests per week so they can test themselves regularly. Schools will be able to retain small on-site testing facilities for those who cannot and haven't been able to test at home. Staff and students at independent learning providers and adult community learning providers will also be able to test at home. On-site testing facilities are already set up in universities, and staff and students there can take 2 tests a week. We are following public health guidance and advising that in circumstances where social distancing cannot be maintained, face coverings should be worn in secondary school classrooms as well as in further and higher education settings. This is a temporary measure to ensure the safe return of schools and will be in place until Easter. All the other safety measures that are already in place continue to be robust, including bubble groups, staggered start and finish times, increasing ventilation and strict hygiene measures. Mr. Speaker, this has been a hugely challenging time for teachers, staff and parents. The House will be well aware of the incredible work that has already gone into minimising the effects of this pandemic. But I know from the research that we've been conducting that it won't be enough. Many children are going to need longer-term support to make up for lost learning. We want families to know that there will be support for schools and for our children. Sir Kevin Collins, our Education Recovery Commissioner, will be working with parents, teachers and schools on a long-term plan to make sure that pupils have the chance to make up their learning over the course of their education. As an immediate support, we're putting in place a range of additional measures to help children and young people across England to help them catch up. We're introducing a new one-off £302 million recovery premium for state primary and secondary schools, building on the pupil premium to further support pupils who need it most. We're expanding our successful tutoring programmes. £200 million will be available to fund an extended national tutoring programme for primary and secondary schools, and tutoring and language support in colleges and early year settings. £200 million will be available for secondary schools to deliver face-to-face summer schools. Schools will be able to target individual pupils' needs. The package will build on the £1 billion catch-up package we announced just a few months ago, and forms part of a wider response to help pupils make up on the lost learning that they've suffered. Mr. Speaker, I would like to update the House on the next steps after we decided that GCSEs, AS and A-Level exams and many vocational and technical qualifications could not go ahead as planned this summer. In January, we launched a joint consultation with Ofqual on the best way to do this, so that the results for the 2021 are as robust and as fair as possible. I'm very glad to say that we got more than 100,000 responses from students, parents, teachers, school leaders and other stakeholders as part of that consultation, and we've considered all of them very carefully. I'd like to assure Honourable and Right Honourable colleagues that there was widespread support for the approach that we are taking. Our priority is and has always been to make sure that every student has the best possible chance to show what they know and can do, enabling them to progress to the next stage of their education, training or employment. The most important thing that we can do is to make sure that the system is fair, that it is fair to every student. It is vital that they have confidence that they will get the grade that is a true and just reflection of their work. Mr. Speaker, this year's students will receive grades determined by their teachers, with assessments covering what they were taught and not what they have missed. Teachers have a good understanding of their students' performance and how they compare to other students this year and from those from previous years. Teachers can choose a range of evidence to underpin their assessments, including coursework, in-class tests set by the school, and the use of optional questions provided by exam boards and mock exams. And we will, of course, give guidance on how best to do this fairly and also consistently. Exam boards will be issuing grade descriptions to help teachers make sure their assessments are fair and consistent. These will be broadly pegged to performance standards from previous years, so teachers and students are clear what is expected at each grade. By doing this, combined with a rigorous quality assurance process, are just two of the ways this system will ensure grades are fair and consistent. Quality assurance by the exam boards will provide a meaningful check in the system and make sure that we can root out malpractice. We will also set out a full and fair appeals system. It will provide a process to enable students to appeal their grades should they believe their grade is wrong. Mr. Speaker, I can confirm that no algorithm will be used for this process. Grades will be awarded on the basis of teachers' judgment and will only ever be changed by human intervention. There must, of course, be as much fairness and rigour applied to vocational and technical qualifications as there is to general qualifications as well. For those qualifications most similar to GCSEs, AS and A-Levels, which enable people to progress on to further and higher education, external exams will not go ahead, and results will be awarded through similar arrangements as set out for GCSEs and A-Levels. Where students are taking VTQs to go straight into a job, exams and assessments should take place in line with public health measures. This is so that students can demonstrate the occupational or professional standards they need to enter the workplace safely. Mr. Speaker, all our children and young people have paid a considerable price for the disruption of the past year. It has knocked their learning off track. It has put their friendships to one side, and it has put some of the wonder of growing up on hold. In short, Mr. Speaker, it has caused enormous damage to what should have been a carefree and exciting part of growing up. I am absolutely committed that with this programme of catch-up measures and the extra funds for tutoring, we can start to put this right. Together with the measures we have set out for a fair and robust allocation of grades, young people will be able to look forward to the next stage of their lives with confidence. Our approach in the face of the worst disruption to education since the Second World War has been to protect the progress of pupils and students. Ultimately, this summer's assessments will ensure fair routes to the next stages of education or the start of their career. That is our overall aim. Mr. Speaker, in summing up, I am sure you would agree with my assessment that as a nation we have perhaps never valued education as much as we do today, and I commend this statement to the House.
I now call Shadow Secretary of State Kate Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement and join him in paying tribute to all staff in our education system. On these benches, we want to see every pupil safely back in class where they can be with their friends, their teachers, and get the structure and stability they need. It's not enough, though, simply to say schools will reopen. There must be a credible plan that will not only enable schools to open fully in March, but will keep them open. And the Secretary of State has failed to use the period when most pupils were not in school to put the necessary measures in place. In January, he said he wanted school staff to be in the next wave of vaccinations. So why has there still been no commitment from the government to prioritise school staff? Does he no longer believe they should be a priority? Many schools have lost income or face higher costs because of the pandemic. Why has he failed to review the funding? One way to reduce transmission of coronavirus is to allow schools to teach on a rota basis. Labour, school leaders and teachers have all asked him to consider this. He has refused. Why? Ventilation has an important role to play in reducing transmission indoors. Will he update his department's guidance to ensure it's clear, robust and specific enough for all schools to implement it effectively? Can he tell me why, months after Labour has called for it, he's not made any progress in providing Nightingale classrooms so more pupils can study in smaller groups? It's welcome that he has finally caught up on Labour's call to expand the wearing of masks in schools, but why is this measure only temporary? I worry that in taking one small step in the right direction while leaving a great many other issues unaddressed, he is failing to do all that can be done to keep schools open, and failing to work with, not against, school staff and their unions. This year's exams were cancelled 52 days ago. For 7 weeks, pupils, parents and staff have faced damaging and utterly unnecessary uncertainty. The Secretary of State could have avoided that by listening to Labour and putting a Plan B in place months ago, but instead he was once again slow to act, with millions of young people paying the price. Now he claims to have solved the problem, but guidance from exam boards won't be available until the end of the spring term, meaning more weeks of anxiety for young people and their teachers. He blamed a rogue algorithm for last year's fiasco, but the real cause of the chaos was not an algorithm. It was his incompetence. So now, for the first time, he said he trusts teachers. I can't help wondering why he only trusts teachers when there's a chance to make them responsible for what happens with exams rather than his department. I am glad a wide range of evidence will be used. Assessment materials will be available for schools. There will be guidance from exam boards on how to award grades, and individual schools won't be responsible for schools. But is he confident grades will be fair and consistent between and across schools? And why has he not used the last 7 weeks to provide appropriate training to teachers? Isn't he concerned that the lack of common evidence and of a link to an existing grade distribution both puts pressure on schools and colleges and creates huge challenges in ensuring fairness? And finally, on assessments, can he update the House on functional skills and end-of-point assessments? Mr. Speaker, it was nearly 6 months ago that Labour first called for a national strategy to help children catch up and to close the attainment gap. And I welcome the appointment of Sir Kelvin Collins to lead education recovery work. I hope this means the Secretary of State is breaking from the great Conservative tradition of only finding work for friends and donors. But can he confirm that yesterday's recovery announcement amounts to just 43 pence per pupil per day over the next school year, and that just 500,000 pupils, fewer than 1 in 3 of those eligible for free school meals, will benefit from summer schemes? Can you tell me why there was no mention whatsoever of the hard-working staff who deliver this summer support, why there's no specific support for children's mental health and well-being, and why there's only limited support for college students? Mr. Speaker, this has been a very challenging year for children, for parents, for education staff, made more challenging by the government's incompetence. With schools set to open their doors to more pupils in a matter of weeks, there is a final chance to put things right. The Secretary of State must do so.
Secretary of State.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. She raises the question of vaccinations for student staff, and she was seen in the roadmap that the Prime Minister launched just on Monday, Mr. Speaker, about setting out the commission for the JCVI to look at the 2 strands. Firstly, those people who are most vulnerable from sadly being either hospitalised or sadly passing away as a result of catching COVID virus, making sure that that's one of the strands as to who needs to be vaccinated out of those groups, but also out of those jobs and professions, not just teachers, but also transport workers, supermarket staff, and so many others who do an amazing job in public-facing roles, and what are the needs of those workforces as well. I don't want to be in a position where I try and preempt the independent work of JCVI, but obviously we look forward to that, seeing what that says. In terms of the Honourable Lady's suggestion of that we're moving to rotas, it's not a route that we want to go down, to moving to rotas. We do want to have, on this side of the household, children back into full-time education. We think that's the best place for children to be in schools. We think it's important for them to be having full-time education in the classroom, Mr. Speaker. This is why when we had in a situation where we were able to welcome all children back, we felt that it was better to be able to welcome all children back into the classroom every day of every week. But as the Honourable Lady briefly touched upon, is testing. Testing is going to be a very important part of, keeping classrooms COVID-free. The rollout of testing that has already been happening over the last 7 weeks has been incredibly successful. We've had some of the highest rates of uptake in terms of testing, Mr. Speaker, of any workforce area and in any, any individual setting, because actually, probably not unsurprisingly, schools have readily adapted to this testing regime. So far, out of all the asymptomatic testing stations that we're hoping to get set up across schools and colleges and special schools, 97% of those settings have set up asymptomatic testing centres. Obviously, there's 3% that we're targeting resources and focus on to ensure that they are ready to do testing for welcoming children back on the 8th. But testing is important for keeping COVID out of the classroom. In terms of exams, I note a comment. We will, working with the exam boards, do everything we can do to ensure there's the absolute maximum amount of guidance, training and support for all teachers in terms of giving the grades out and making the assessment for what is the correct grade. And we've been working closely with the exam boards to ensure that this is done swiftly to support teachers, and I know that they will be offering a broad range of support to all teachers and schools in terms of making making sure that teacher-assessed grades are done fairly right across the system. And the Honourable Lady makes an important point about as much consistency as possible in terms of awarding of grades. And this is why we've been doing work with exam boards to ensure that there is random sampling across schools and colleges across the country, both state schools and private schools, as well as making sure that there's systems in place where there are clear anomalies and there's uncertainty about it, that there are proper checks in place to ensure that there is no malpractice within the system.
Let's head to the chair of the Select Committee, Robert Halford. Robert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my right honourable friend for the 1.7 billion for catch-up. It's a remarkable achievement, and I hope will make a difference to our children. On exams, the decision to adopt centre-assessed grades for the second year in a row does highlight the severity of the damage school closures have done. And whilst I accept that it's the least worst option that the government has come up with, my concern is not so much about having one's cake and eating it, but baking a rock cake of grade inflation into the system. So will my right honourable friend confirm what is the government's plan to ensure we will not have a wild west of grading, that these grades will be meaningful to employers so as not to damage children's life chances, and when and how will we reverse the grade inflation? And what is the rationale for not tethering this year's grades to last year's or somewhere between 2019 and 2020? And why not embed quality assurance more broadly rather than rely on random sampling spot and checks?
So, State.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for his comments in relation to how we deliver the in terms of catch-up, and I also appreciate some of his thinking and ideas, which, as you can see, is got embedded into some of the policy work that we've been doing in terms of the catch-up work. He raises an important issue about grade inflation, and this is why we have been doing so much work with the exam boards, with Ofqual, in terms of ensuring that there's the proper internal checks as well as the proper external checks. We didn't feel as if it would be possible to peg to a certain year, because sadly, as a result of doing that, it would probably entail the use of some form of algorithm in order to be able to deliver that. This is why we've put a much greater emphasis on those internal and external quality assurance checks that we'll be working with the exam boards and schools to ensure there is consistency. But in the future, he raises the important point, the best form of assessment, as I know my honourable friend also believes, is examination. And we do want to be moving back into a position to be bringing exams back, as it is ultimately the fairest and most equal way of doing assessment of all young people.
I said to the West Midlands with Steve McCabe. Steve.
Mr. Speaker, does the Secretary of State plan to issue specific guidance on how factors such as number of rooms at a child's home, number of siblings sharing that home, and level of access to IT equipment will be taken into account when assessing? Otherwise, how can any pandemic grades be judged as equitable?
So, State.
Well, we believe, Mr. Speaker, that the people who will, when you're not in a position to be able to run exams, the best way of making the assessment as to the work and the progress that that child has made is to be done by a teacher. And the teacher's assessment and judgment is the best one to be guided by.
Remaining in the West Midlands with Mike Wood. Mike Wood.
Me, the Education Secretary, married into a teaching family, and I know that he'll join me in recognising the phenomenal work done by teachers and school staff in Dudley South throughout this pandemic. But there are different messages coming from medical professionals to those coming from teaching unions about the risk of teachers and other staff being infected if they return to the classroom. What scientific evidence is my right honourable friend able to share regarding the level of risk that teachers are at relative to the wider population?
Well, I'd very much like to join my honourable friend and neighbour in paying tribute to the amazing work of teachers, not just in Dudley South, but right across the country, for work that they and support staff have been doing, keeping the doors of schools opening, welcoming the children of critical workers and vulnerable children all the way through this pandemic, and also delivering brilliant online learning and remote education for so many of our children. My honourable friend raises a really important point. When Professor Chris Whitty stands at the podium and makes it clear about the need for children to be able to return to school, I think this is an incredibly powerful approach, and something that I think the British people will listen to. And of course, parents, teachers, children, and all staff in schools will take real confidence from. And, there is incredibly an enormous amount of evidence to show what a safe place that schools are. I would point to the evidence that was produced and the data that was produced as part of a roadmap that was released on Monday, but also the further information that we as a department released as part of the guidance that we also set out on Monday, making it clear about how important it is for children to be back in school, enjoying their education, but this is a safe environment for them to be learning in.
Let's head to the North East with Emma Llewellyn-Bulk.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Contrary to what the Secretary of State has just said, the scientific consensus tells us that we need to wait for cases to be extremely low and have a phased return of children into schools. Yet the Education Secretary is sending 10 million children back into classrooms en masse. Staff have contacted me scared for their health and for their pupils' health, worried that the government haven't put in place measures needed to make our schools safe. If he was on top of his brief and engaging with the profession, he would have used his time this morning to allay their fears. Will he take that opportunity now?
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it's disappointing that the Honourable Member for South Shields really does show off instinctive reaction of many people in her party that they don't want children to be going back to school. And that is certainly not the case on this side of the House. And we have put out very clearly a system of controls working with Public Health England. This is why we have taken the difficult decision to introduce COVID testing, not just for staff at primary schools, but for the staff and also all the children in secondary schools and colleges, making sure that we keep classrooms COVID free, making sure that the system of controls there, working with Public Health England, are robust and strong to keep our children safe, to keep our workforce safe, and to keep our families and communities safe as well.
Video link to Peter Aldous.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome my honourable friend, the Secretary of State's statement. Further education colleges like East Coast College are preparing for and will arrange a return as from 8th March, though organising free tests on site during that week for 5,000 students and 650 members of staff before moving to home testing will present a significant logistical challenge. I'll be most grateful if my right honourable friend can confirm that his department will work with colleges in a collaborative and flexible way to address this and any other obstacles that may arise.
Secretary of State.
We absolutely will be working with both colleges and schools in order to support them, and we're putting not just the equipment at their disposal, but also financial resources as well for them to be able to roll out this massive testing programme. But colleges will have 2 weeks in order to be able to conduct those 3 tests, and also we've given colleges and schools the flexibility to allow students and children to come into college and school prior to the 8th of March in order to be able to take the tests before the official start of school reopening on the 8th of March.
Number 7 withdrawn. So Robbie Moore.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's great to hear that all schools and all year groups will be returning on the 8th of March. Teachers across Keighley and Ilkley have been working exceptionally hard over the past months to ensure that children's learning has remained as unaffected as possible and deserve all our thanks and support moving forward. But some schools in my constituency are raising concerns about the rollout and logistics of testing for students. So may I ask that my right honourable friend does all he can to provide the support for those schools going forward?
Secretary of State.
My honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight this point. This is why we put a substantial financial package and support be available to schools if they need to bring in extra resources in order to be able to roll out that testing programme. This is why we have the 1 week period starting from the 8th of March where they can be bringing in those year groups so they can get tested and straight back into class, but also giving them the flexibility to enable students to be able to come in earlier than the 8th of March if they wish to do so, so that they're able to get tested prior to the official start of a new term.
Munira Wilson.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The pandemic restrictions have caused much damage to our children and young people across the country. The Secretary of State has made bold assertions in the last 24 hours that no child's life shall be blighted, and he says we've never valued education as much as we do today. Yet his spending commitment to children's recovery is the equivalent of between 3 and 4% of the annual schools budget. Compare that to the spending on the discredited test and trace system, which is almost half the annual schools budget. Why is he not more ambitious for our children and putting forward a more generous, longer-term package that focuses on their well-being and their emotional as well as educational recovery?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This is very much part of our overall plan in terms of raising standards in education. We wanted to give schools a sense of what they're going to be able to do and what they're going to be able to plan for over the next coming weeks and months and give them that immediate notice. But what we saw is over £1 billion being funneled to help our schools and students straight away, topped up by a further £700 million. And as I said, our ambitions do not stop there, Madam Deputy Speaker. We want to go much further, making sure that we deliver the reform and change that is so crucial to making sure that children get the very best in everything they do get in terms of education, making sure it's focused on them. And that is what we're going to be delivering, not just over the coming months, but also over the coming years.
Before I call the next speaker, just a gentle reminder that I do want to try to get everybody in. So I would ask the questioners to be brief and obviously the answers as well. We now go to Sir Robert Neal.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. About 7% of children in England go to fee-paying schools. Their pupils face pressures in learning at home. Many of their parents have had incomes severely impacted by the consequences of the pandemic. Can my right honourable friend tell me what discussions has he had and what guidance does he propose to give to that private sector to see what can be done to ensure that children there also benefit from appropriate catch-up provision and roll good practice to that effect?
Secretary of State.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for his question, and it's important that we do everything we can do to help all children right across the country. This is why the guidance and the evidence, especially working with the Education Endowment Foundation, is freely available and there to support all schools, whether they're state schools or whether they're private schools. And we'll always make sure that evidence, information and very best guidance and best practice is available for schools, available in the private sector as well as the state sector.
We now go to Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Sorry, problems muting then. Thanks, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've seen a roadmap back to education done on the back of an envelope, and today, only weeks from exam season, it appears detailed exam guidance won't be available until the end of the spring term. There's nothing concrete to account for differentials in lost learning, no detail on the quality assurance process, nor how schools and colleges will be supported with the grading process at the same time as helping pupils catch up. So will the Secretary recognise that he needs to bring forward detailed guidance this week so that pupils and teachers can adequately plan. Otherwise, I fear he's walking us into yet another shambles.
Secretary of State.
Well, it's always lovely to hear from the Honourable Lady, and thank her very much for her comments. And what I would say is that we've set out a very comprehensive plan in terms of return of pupils back into education, and let's face it, something that she would always be opposed to, as she seems to think that the only thing a school should be done is to be shut. She has never, in her time, either on the front bench or even on the back benches, ever sort of taken up the baton for children to actually campaign to have them in school. She seems to take the view that they're best at home. That's not a view that members on this side of the House have.
Video link to Jonathan Gullis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome my right honourable friend's statement. My right honourable friend will know in November last year I published a report with Onward advocating for a shorter summer break as it statistically helps prevent the attainment gap widening, especially important for disadvantaged pupils. So does my right honourable friend agree with my idea, particularly as we help to catch up children on the lost face-to-face learning in classrooms due to this global pandemic?
Chief State.
I remember reading my honourable friend's report and, reached much more broadly than just the issue that he raised. But he is right to raise the important issue of how we look at the sort of structures in education. And I'd very much encourage him to sort of sit down with myself and also with Sir Kevin Collins to discuss some of his thoughts and ideas, and be always very keen to talk about the whole breadth of what can be done to really drive attainment for children, especially from children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds.
Video link, Tahir Ali.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have been contacted by a number of concerned parents and teachers from my constituency of Birmingham Hall Green, who have expressed worry about the safety of schools opening on the 8th of March. Will the Secretary of State assure us that he is doing all in his power to work closely with parents, teachers, their trade unions and communities to ensure upon return to schools on the 8th of March that sufficient resources and support is in place for every school to ensure that school staff should be prioritised to receive the vaccine to prevent further disruption to children's learning, given that the Secretary of State himself has previously said he believes education staff should be prioritised for vaccination. So can he tell the House why this is not happening now?
Just a reminder again, we do need to have fairly brief questions if I'm going to get everybody in. Secretary of State.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will try and give a brief answer. What we always want to do is to give much assurance to both those who work in schools, but also parents and children themselves about the safety measures that we have put in place. This is why we have developed the current suite of and set of controls for safety in schools with Public Health England, taking on the very best public health advice.
Video link, Holly Mumby-Croft.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Children's experiences over the last year will no doubt have varied greatly, but I'm particularly worried about children with extra challenges such as dyslexia. Can my honourable friend tell me how we will ensure that all children who learn differently will receive the extra support that they need to catch up and reach their potential?
Secretary of State.
Well, this is why we felt it was so important to give some flexibility to schools and to teachers who will obviously understand their children best of all and really understand their individual learning needs. Because we obviously quite rightly often look at some of the challenges in terms of children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds, but learning needs and learning challenges can vary right across, regardless of what people's parents earn or the background that they come from. So this is why we need to give teachers the flexibility to target that support most appropriately to the child.
Video link to Richard Bergen.
Madam Deputy Speaker, on Monday, the very day the Prime Minister announced his Big Bang school return, the minutes of SAGE scientific advisors were published. They recommend a phased reopening of schools. Another group of government scientific advisors warns that full school reopenings could increase R by up to 60%. Now, the devolved administrations are listening to that evidence and taking a phased approach. Just last month, the Prime Minister called schools vectors of transmission. So why is the government now ignoring the advice of the scientific advisors? And isn't this a reckless gamble that unnecessarily risks a spike in community transmission of the virus?
State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, at every stage we put the well-being of our children and those who work in schools very much at the heart of everything we do. But we do believe that children benefit from being in school, and like the Honourable Gentleman, and that's why we're very pleased by taking this cautious approach, we're able to welcome all children back.
Video link, Sean Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, we've made a lot about schools, but we cannot forget that a significant number of young people and children are in vocational education and on apprenticeships. I've recently been contacted by BCTG Group in my constituency in Albury, very concerned about the large number of apprentices who have not been able to carry forward their qualification because they've not been able to access functional English and mathematics courses during the pandemic. Can I ask my right honourable friend what work he's doing to ensure that apprentices across the Black Country and more widely can access these vital functional skills courses and that they don't get locked in and can finally achieve those qualifications that they've worked so hard for?
Chief State.
My honourable friend raises a very important point. That's why they'll be available to access these courses online, so they're able to complete their studies and their training.
Video link, Bill Esterson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yesterday, the Education Secretary said that schools could hire more staff with £6,000 from his department. Can I just ask the Education Secretary, how much does he think a teacher gets paid?
Secretary of State.
Well, I very much hope the Honourable Gentleman got the copy of the Skills for Jobs white paper that I had sent him, which he had obviously not read when he asked his last question. And if the Honourable Gentleman will also be aware that I'm fully aware that teachers are not paid £6,000. Thankfully, as a result of this government's interventions, starting salaries for teachers are going to be hitting £30,000 a year for newly qualified teachers very, very shortly. But what we are doing is we're giving schools the ability to use that extra resource to bring in over, pay for extra support for a few weeks to boost the learning and the education of children in lots of different settings. That might be on English, it might be on maths, it might be for sports, it might be for a whole different range of areas. But it's odd to see a Labour politician not seeming to welcome the fact that we're putting more money in education, but maybe it betrays his true colours.
Video link, Selene Saxby.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. For students at the excellent FE College Petrock in my North Devon constituency who were due to sit their vocational and technical exams, today's announcement will provide much welcome certainty. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that in continuing with exams and assessments, in cases where students will need to demonstrate their knowledge to a professional standard, we can help them progress into a good job more rapidly?
Secretary of State.
It's an incredibly important point my honourable friend raises, because we must ensure that those youngsters and people of all ages who are doing those technical and vocational qualifications that need that ability to demonstrate their professional competency are able to do so. It's absolutely vital that we open up our college system and open up our training providers to ensure that they're able to continue to progress.
Video link, Ruth Cadbury.
Following on from the question from my honourable friend from North Devon, FE colleges such as West Thames have had years of underfunding, yet they work hard to ensure young people get the skills and they need. September's new students will have had almost 2 years of disrupted learning and limited time in school. So can the Minister tell the House what additional support is the government making available for FE colleges?
Well, this was an important part of a £700 million extra funding that we've been made available, and making sure that there is funding there for FE colleges in order to be able to deliver and expand their tutoring and catch-up programmes that they've already got there. But this is on against a backdrop of increasing funding for our amazing further education colleges that we value so highly.
Video link to Derek Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the statement from the Secretary of State. However, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am concerned that we are asking children to wear face coverings in the classroom. Can I ask the Secretary of State to confirm that adequate consideration has been given to understand the impact this will have on a teacher's ability to interact and engage with his or her class? Also, what consideration has been given to the impact on a child's ability to learn and concentrate effectively? And will he set out the scientific evidence that demonstrates the need for secondary school age children to wear a face covering in the classroom? Thank you.
Secretary of State.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for raising the question. We obviously always work incredibly closely with Public Health England at every stage, and we obviously, and I'm sure, I know my honourable friend also wanted to see the opening of all schools for all pupils at the earliest stage. And in order to do this, one of the key elements of helping assist that smooth return was the advice that Public Health England gave us on the wearing of face masks.
Video link Charlotte Nichols.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There's been a lot of talk today about children and the apparently reduced risk in schools due to the age profile of the students. But alongside overlooking the staff in those schools, I worry we're also overlooking the urgent issues of safety and lost education for adult learners in further education colleges like Warrington and Vale Royal College in my constituency, especially those on trade courses that really can't be delivered remotely. So can the Secretary of State please tell the House how he will be ensuring that there is adequate catch-up support in place for further education?
Secretary of State.
Well, I'd just like to refer to my question and my answer to the honourable member for Brentworth and Ellsworth in terms of extra support that's been made available to further education colleges.
Video link Caroline Noakes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I please put in a plea for this year's Year 10 cohort who will be taking their GCSE examinations in summer 2022? We have plenty of time to consider what those exams might look like. And please will my right honourable friend set out the details of that as soon as he possibly can, reassure young people and indeed their parents.
Secretary of State.
I would very much like to reassure my right honourable friend that we're currently working with Ofqual and the exam boards on that exact piece of work right now, and we would hope to be able to share that in the not too distant future.
Video link Zara Sultana.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. University students have been treated appallingly. They were encouraged to return to campuses in September with the promise of a normal university experience, only to be fenced in, fobbed off, and unable to access rooms they signed for. They've paid an estimated £1 billion for empty, unused accommodation, and the impact on their mental health has been dire. Students at more than 50 universities, including Coventry and Warwick in my constituency, are now on strike. So will the Secretary of State listen to the rent strikers and offer rent refunds, rent releases, and finally put an end to fees and the marketised higher education system that has driven this injustice?
State.
Well, the Honourable Lady is probably aware that my Honourable friend, the Universities Minister, set out a set of packages and support for university students as part of a £70 million hardship fund, and I'd be happy to get my Honourable friend, the Minister for Universities, to write to her with the details of that.
Video link to Hugh Merriman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Secretary of State and the ministerial team for getting our schools reopened for the 8th of March and for his statement. Can I ask him that, notwithstanding the lack of national coursework benchmarking, that he's confident that there are sufficient assessments in place to stop teachers being pressured by parents for grades and also to prevent grade inflation? And can I also urge him to ditch the face mask in classrooms by Easter? I think that's absolutely essential.
Secretary of State.
I know my honourable friend's always had very strong views on this in terms of face masks, and I very much note his comments, and it will be reviewed during the Easter holidays. Madam Deputy Speaker, he's right to highlight the concerns of teachers being under pressure from parents. This is why we've put in an extensive and robust internal quality inspection system where the head teacher has to sign off and verify the results that are given by the teachers, as well as external assessments by the exam boards to ensure that the grading is in line with where it should be.
Final question is video link to Layla Moran.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could I ask the Secretary of State for clarification on the use of fines, particularly in the case for parents who are immunocompromised and who worry about children bringing coronavirus into the home? As he'll know, we still don't have evidence on whether the vaccine works for this group. And the all-party group had horrific evidence given by a parent who was told she's had her life, she should put her daughter's education first. Does he agree that surely this kind of language is unacceptable and that a compassionate approach needs to be taken in these extreme circumstances?
Secretary of State.
I very much agree with the Honourable Lady. That sort of language is absolutely not acceptable, and something that genuinely surprises me would have come from any school or education establishment who are usually so incredibly good at showing compassion and understanding. I'd be happy to, I know that my right honourable friend, the Minister for School Standards, would be happy to meet with her in order to be able to discuss this in more detail. We saw during from September onwards, schools showing sensible and level of discretion in terms of, yes, school is quite clearly mandatory and fines can be applied, but showing some good sense in terms of working with families to ensure that their children were attending schools and making sure that all risk was minimised.
Thank the Secretary of State for his statement, and we'll have a 3-minute suspension to